welcome to the Archives Live. I'm Samantha Mackey, and I'm here with Sarah Milligan, head of the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program, and David Peters, head of the OSU Archives. Thank you all for tuning in today, and how are y'all doing today?
Doing great.
So enjoying the weather. Feels
Great.
like we can have this conversation because it's finally fall.
Right. So thank you guys again for joining us today, and thank you guys for joining us here today. So this month, we're talking a little bit about urban legends and mysteries of OSU. So how do things kind of become urban legends?
I'm so excited to talk about this. So I want to say first that I may be department head for the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program, but I'm also a folklorist. And one of the things that folklorists study is urban legends and the way that we understand culture and myth. So this is so fun for me. Along those lines, whenever the people who do study things like urban legends, and we record the way that different people come about these things and document like all the different variations and all that kinds of things, one of the things that we think about whenever you're trying to figure out, like, is something that somebody's telling you, like maybe an urban legend, or maybe it's something that really happened, and you're working this through your mind. There's a couple of actual like sort of tests you can run it through. So you can think about, is this something that is just really too convenient, right? Like, are all the things really just kind of like laid out there to where they fall into place really perfectly? So maybe it's just a little bit too well fitted. Is it something that is maybe an indeterminate time? So like a few years ago, or way back in the day, or, in the 60s, or just something that's really vague as to it's not going to commit to a time, or necessarily it might be tied to a place, but it maybe had vague pieces. Are there changing pieces that happen whenever people tell it? Like, oh no, that was so-and-so, but it was so-and-so. It was like the student at the end of the semester that was stressed out by grades and stressed out by finals, but it was then it was a student who was breaking up with her boyfriend who was stressed out by, so like are those pieces sort of sometimes moving? And the other thing is, like, when you think about sources, like, where did this person that you're talking about this to, where did they hear it? And often one of the key triggers for this is, well, I heard this from a friend of a friend, right? Like, that is like the F for F, friend of a friend for a friend, friend of a friend. So think about all those big things. Like, what is it someone trying to tell you? Is it something that is like way too comfortable and way too polished, and at the same time a little vague, either when it happened or to whom it happened or who you first heard this for? So it's kind of the same thing that you run through any information sort of truth telling. And I think I feel like we're getting better at sort of sourcing these in the last few years anyway, but it's just, you run it through those tests of could this be true? And if I wanted to find out if it is true, do I have enough information in this that I could actually start to research that? Like, do I know enough about who it might involve that I could go to a newspaper article or something like that? So basically, you also gut check it a little bit. If someone's telling you something and you're like, oh, that's really interesting, I would love to believe this, and you're like, I'm trying really hard to believe this, it's probably not true in the sense. It doesn't mean it's not based in some root of fact. And one of the biggest ways that urban legends can catch on and be successful is if they could be true, right? Like, you could see how it could possibly totally happen, even if it's really inconceivable that it actually did, right? And so sometimes things are rooted in those like nuggets of truth, or maybe not even nugget of happenstance, and just sort of build out over time.
But I think sometimes too, it's also easier to cloud the issue now with technology. So we can track down perhaps the source, but then you can create alternative,
or a false source, even. Yeah.
Right. And sometimes that can kind of cloud whether something is true or not.
Yeah. Or you point to something that seems it's likely, but it's not real, right?
Right.
Like, oh, this could totally be it. I can see this is the smoking gun. This is the of this, or whatever it is. And it's just like, nah, if you really try and dig down deeper, it's not. It just seems convenient that it could be. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So if you're just now joining us, this is Archives Live. If you have any questions about campus urban legends or mysteries, or you've heard of any, feel free to go ahead and put them in the comments, and we will read them live on stream and talk about them. Right now, one of the more popular urban legends on campus is that there are a bunch of tunnels that run under campus. So is that real? Is that true? Or is it just blown way out of proportion.
That is not a legend. There are tunnels that run across the campus. They were designed initially about 1910 to move utilities, so power, water, sometimes gas, underground when we built our first power plant in 1910. So they began building these tunnels. They connected the early part of campus, which is around Old Central. But of course, as campus has expanded, the tunnels have expanded. And as the power plants have changed in locations, those tunnel locations have also changed. But there are tunnels. They're not accessible. They're restricted access. But yes, there's a whole network of tunnels under this campus. And if you had to, you could get from one place to another through the tunnel system. So it's not a legend. It's true.
But the question is, what do people say happens in those tunnels? That could be the legend part. If there's people saying, oh, well, somebody could come from one to the other and, 10 years ago or some time ago.
So a myth or a legend I've heard is that a student actually lived in the tunnels back in the 50s for a semester. I don't know if it's true or not.
Listen to all the keys there, though, right?
Right.
That's great. Yeah. So the tunnels are like sort of the factual truth piece of that you can totally conceive something would happen in, but.
Yeah. And I didn't hear it from a friend of a friend.
The tunnel. But maybe the 50s someone lived down there,
right,
maybe, right?
Yeah.
Right. So another story that's more of a superstition is that if a student walks up the front steps of Morrill Hall, she won't graduate in 4 years. So does that kind of follow the same path as an urban legend? And kind of like, where does that sort of thing come from?
Is it just for women? Just
won't,
or for men or women?
Men or women,
women.
It's any student.
So from what I'm aware, that's a fairly recent one. When I was in school here in the 70s, I don't remember that at all. Or maybe it's just maybe it's regional. Maybe it has to do with Morrill Hall and the English department being in Morrill Hall and some creative English student was 4 years out and hadn't graduated yet and had to come up with an excuse to their parents. I don't know, but I think that's a fairly recent one. But I'm not sure how it transitions into becoming a superstition. Or
I think it's just the more people to repeat it, right?
Right.
And I think a lot of the times when you're talking about whether it's superstitions or whether it's urban legends or anything, they're often trying to comment on something, right? Like, so you think about what that is trying to say, and it's really looking at the stress students have and how often, because of that stress, it's easier to sometimes look for places to be like, well, if I wouldn't have walked up the stairs, and though I don't really think anyone's ever going to say I failed out of school because I walked up the stairs, but there's always that thing we're looking for that kind of says, well, maybe this was outside of something I could control, right? And so I think that's how some of those things get born and also perpetuate. Who knows how that, we will probably never know the first instance that someone said, well, this is, it was all because I walked up the stairs. But I think the fact that it keeps being told over and over and over is what is really, sort of interesting to look at with that too.
And those stairs are a little unusual in that that's the only staircase on campus that goes to the second floor. Mm-hmm. Every place else, stairs lead to the first floor if there are stairs. That's the only one that goes to the second floor, so it's a little unique in that way. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if that's a distinctive thing or not, but that's the only place on campus that has that feature.
Someone could do a research paper on that and see if they can actually figure it out or pin it down or all that kind of stuff. So,
yeah. So David, you have some photos to show with us, don't you?
Well, I did. Oh. I think I have to re-log in here. Oh, there we go. Okay. So this is Williams Hall was located between where the fire station is now and the Saratine Center. So there's a little parking lot there. Was Williams Hall. It was kind of a Gothic style. We call it Prairie Gothic style structure. Many of the buildings in downtown Guthrie still have very similar style in the turrets and the round windows, the stone. But anyway, what's interesting about Williams Hall, it was first of all one of our early buildings, but then its look is different than other buildings. It kind of has that mystical, eerie feeling about it. And it was also built in 3 different sections, and so there are places in Williams Hall where you could go to the second floor in one section, but then to go to the second floor in another section, you actually had to leave the building and come back around. So there were hallways that didn't connect, and sometimes when they added another section, they would close off doors, and so there'd still be a frame for a door, and maybe a door was there, but it didn't go anywhere. There'd be a wall on the other side. So people have talked about, I think, that Gothic architecture and the age of the building and built in many sections, people always talked about how it was maybe inhabited by other spirits or whatever. And I can give you one example. There was a skeleton. It was also, it housed the library and like biology, where other classes were taught there. But there was a skeleton, and we think it was a fake, artificial skeleton. But there was a skeleton in Williams Hall, and they would dress it up periodically in different attire. And I'm sure they would bring it out at Halloween. So that was another feature of Williams Hall. And then I'm not sure if they can see, but Morrill Hall is also one of our older buildings, and we just talked about the steps, the only place on campus where the steps actually go up to the second floor, and it was designed that way. But there are entrances on the first floor, so you can enter that way. So I'm not sure why the second floor steps were forbidden. But and let's see what else we got here. That's just another picture of Morrill Hall. This is probably the best one, showing the steps and the column of the front of Morrill. There's the skeleton, and they dressed it up. The editor of the yearbook that year had a picture of him when he first started, bright young man, and then he said by the end of the year he looked like the skeleton from that. So, then also Vet Med has some interesting animals that have been donated that have had challenges, malformed in some way, and skeletons over there. And so sometimes there have been some mysteries associated with some of the donated animals in Vet Med. So they also had a human skeleton there. And here's a front picture of Williams Hall. So anyway, hopefully that gives some kind of background to some of the facilities and places that have had reputations.
It's a great way of putting it. We have a question from William, and he wants to know, what is your favorite campus tall tale?
You know way more of them than I do.
Tall tale. Well, one thing I think is interesting is probably our most popular picture, and it's featured periodically in our Facebook page, is Streaker Night. And the bull going into Theta Pond. Mm-hmm. There have been literally hundreds of people who all claim they were the one who rode the bull into the pond. Now, I think there were 2 or 3 people who rode the bull in the pond, but there weren't hundreds of people. And so we do have a picture of the bull in the pond with several people on it and a lot of people around it. But the claim that they were on the bull has been exaggerated by many folks. I found those kinds of events or those stories interesting because there was an event, just people have put themselves into it at a position or level maybe they hadn't really participated in.
And it gets a little bit bigger with each telling.
Each yell.
Yeah. When we do oral history interviews and we talk to people about their time on campus, some of those things do come out too. And, for example, there's a lot of people that talk about like the alligator in Theta Pond or several different versions of, and things like that. And some of those sound like they could be more contemporary legend than maybe fact, but there is some fact based in those too.
There was Sam the alligator in Theta Pond for a short time. So there was a reality. There was an incident where some students took a bull, I think, or a steer into an elevator at the student union. But I've heard that same story told for other facilities. But we think it only happened at the union.
That's the only, and we have. That's actually really those are interesting pieces to bring together, because I think the student union actually did happen because there was some student conduct things that came out of that. And there's some evidence there, and we have interviews with some people who say that they were involved in that, and kind of talking about it a little jokingly. And then we have at least one interview where someone talks about it, and it's not really funny anymore. So it's one of those things that even though people usually after they tell it over and over, it's continues to get blown up, just like a lot of these pieces do, where it's just like, oh well, bigger and bigger, and what else happened to the bull, and what did the bull do? But really, I think it's interesting to get down to the heart of when you can find what actually happened, which sometimes in oral history we do try and find people who were actually there. I mean, that's what we try and do. We find people who experience things firsthand, and we talk to them about those. And so we did an Amplified Oklahoma, our podcast in oral history. We did an episode where we looked at different ways of memory in the way that we understand events, and used Sam the alligator and the bull to illustrate those different things. So that has always been interesting to me too.
Great. We have a comment from Bonnie, and she said that when she was an undergrad in the late 90s, the Morrill Hall legend was being spread. She's surprised that one is still going strong. Well, and I remember when I was a freshman, I entered as an English major, and they gave us a tour of Morrill Hall, and they told us not to walk up the front steps. So it's still something that's being talked about really, really recently.
So who told you that?
I don't remember if it was an orientation leader or just a regular campus tour guide, but it was definitely somebody that had a little bit of influence over the incoming freshman students.
Well, it's interesting what the campus tour guides pick up, because I mean, obviously, you have to walk through all this, and you're trying to not bore people to death too. And so I think that is a lot of places that, especially campus lore, gets picked up and perpetuated, is through some campus tours and through guides and different people, and then they talk to each other and talk about how that was responded to and what reaction you get. And there's a lot of really, really common campus legends that are out there that it would be interesting to know if people have heard them in relation to OSU too. I mean, some of the really, really common ones are, for example, a lot of campus libraries across the country have a legend attached to it that the building is sinking, and the building's sinking because the architecture developed the building but didn't factor in the weight of the books. And so when they put the books in, that the building started to sink, or the building can never be at full capacity with books because then it will start to, there's like all these pieces to it. And that's one that I think whenever people hear it, they think, oh, that's definitely our library. But when you take the survey, it's, this just widely spread across different campuses. And there's just a lot of really interesting, almost everyone has like a ghost in the dorm, it seems like, and it's usually some very tragic young lady who was either jilted by a boyfriend or couldn't hack the finals or was being tormented by somebody who was making noises next door, or whatever it is, or ghosts in the library. There's a lot of those. So it would be interesting. It's interesting to see what crosses, not only just what sticks at OSU over time, but what crosses over various college campuses, and how those things get perpetuated and moved to is really interesting.
So,
I'm just going to add, I've passed by numerous campus tours over time.
Yeah, sure.
And at times I've wanted to jump in, but I keep thinking, why ruin a good story with the truth? So I just let them go, and because it really, the story is in fact, I will stop and listen sometimes to the story just to hear what people are saying. So anyway.
So are these kinds of legends popular on all college campuses?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So is the library haunted?
Well, I think it depends on how you feel about that. I think if this is the question. Are you asking if people think that there might be a ghost in the library? Of course, there are plenty of people who have stories about that. David, I don't know. What do you think?
And I'm a skeptic, so I'm not a true believer. But I've heard stories. I've heard a number of people talk about, especially in the basement, a woman dressed in a certain attire. I think it's a red dress, but it's a certain. They describe a certain color dress, and she's there, and then all of a sudden she's not there. And so I've heard this. I've been here almost 35 years, and so I've heard people talk about that. I've never witnessed it, so.
Yeah, I have heard the basement story too.
Okay. There's also been instances where people claim that books have just fallen off the shelf. All of a sudden, the book just was on the floor. I don't know whether someone was on the other side, putting a book back in, and the book caught and knocked it over. Who knows? But you can look at two people can look at the same event and get a different impression of what happened. So.
Right. Okay. So one last question before we go. If I wanted to research some of these legends on my own and kind of try and figure out if I can maybe see where they started, or maybe try and figure out if they're based more in truth or fiction, where in the archival collections could I look?
So do you have some oral histories that include some material as well?
We do have oral histories. Specifically, we have lots of oral histories specifically about OSU. Several hundred interviews with the alumni and former and current faculty and staff. And people do, every once in a while, they talk about sort of like, some of those things. They're not going to be in great detail, though. I think actually, if someone's interested in this topic just in general, to get a better understanding of maybe how to identify or how to think about these things, there's some really good books in the library as well, though. Like Jan Brunvard is someone who's written extensively about about urban legends, and has, for example, the Urban Legend Encyclopedia of Urban Legends, and several books that go through this. Simon Bronner is a really good person to look at. Linda Daig. There are just some really, I think Simon Bronner actually wrote like a campus urban legend book about, like urban legends that just kind of perpetuate across college campuses that you can check out. I think you can even check that out here as an ebook. But I know if you're thinking about specifically trying to dig down on when the first instance of something maybe was reported or talked about for a specific tale or version of a tale.
So then we have specific resources for OSU. The old yearbooks will sometimes mention. You can't tell if it's in play or not. We have old publications like the Aggivator that would include stuff like this. Then of course the Daily Collegian and its predecessor titles. Those are all available for people to search online, and there'll be stories in there. They can search to see how often it's been mentioned and what time periods. Maybe different things have come up in the student newspapers. Plus we have the Centennial History series, and there are a few mentions within the series of events or purported events. So between the periodicals, the yearbooks, and the O'Colly, and then the Centennial History series, they can probably discover some other things in the archives.
Great. Well, David, Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you to you, our viewers, for tuning in and liking and sharing this video. If you'd like to see more from the archives, you can check out the archives Facebook page or check out any of the digital collections that they have mentioned. We have videos on OkState TV and YouTube, and the websites will be listed at the end of the video. So once again, thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next month on Archives Live.